Hello, this is Mad Cat, and welcome to another impromptu video. Well, sort of impromptu. I mean, it's been sort of planning this. It's just I haven't had much time to actually get to do it, and it's like today I'm forcing myself to do it. But yes, impromptu video. I'm just uploading my YouTube on my cell phone that's not connected to any network. Not that that's really important right now, but at least I can use the Wi-Fi. But I love when people put messages in the chat. I love to read those. So let's see here. There we go. Make sure the audio is working. Messages in the chat. All right. So if you have a message, please put it there. Now, this video is a series I've been working on the trigger warnings article about the need to find evidence that trigger warnings actually affect people. Now, the difficulty with this article, well, the thing I like about this article is it tries to show both sides of the argument, which is very good. I mean, an article like this should do it, but then the author just ignores the opposition to his viewpoint completely. And then just says, well, we haven't found evidence, but we should still go out there and look for it. So before I get started with that, I am going to do a little shilling up front. So, because I realize a lot of people don't see don't make it to the end of the video. So I want to just go ahead and throw a couple things out. You can get all the links down below for this, but this is, well, as I say on my videos, is that I'm trying to save up right now for a modern computer so I can do video editing, primarily so I can teach classes online. I have a number of ideas that are rather unique that I believe I would be an effective teacher, but I need a computer that can do video rendering. So this right here is something that one of my fans created. Came in Frog. It's a group that's responsible for Gator and Frog on Twitch. I believe they do some stuff on YouTube, and I'm just going to start doing videos with them as well. But they really want to help me out with this goal of getting me enough money that I can build a bare minimum computer that would be capable of video rendering. Certainly, the more I have, the more powerful of computer I can get. But if you can give anything at all for this, I'd greatly appreciate it. Please, please, please share this out to as many people as you can. This is the kind of thing that, well, this is my next step. And whether I get help or I do this on my own, this is the next thing I need to get in order for my life to become more secure. With this, I can build up my life. I also want to give a shout out to my book, How to Destroy a Woman Now. As you can see, it has 4 customer reviews, 4 stars. I think the people who have put reviews up, Carl, Melinda, Jenny, and Larry, even though his 1 star is basically that this book is complete trash and poorly written. Durr. But this was my response into a similar title, How to Destroy a Man Now, which that book is a lot worse than this one. But it's my goal to try to get this to #1 spot so that I want Amazon to take this book down. I really don't want this book to be up, but while the other one is up, this book is up. And I'm hoping, because the other book contains illegal information, it contains how to basically give false information to destroy someone. So I'm hoping my book encourages Amazon to take down both books. But Go ahead and purchase this book. This also helps me, try to get some money together to try to do the things that I need to do. All right. So that's enough shilling for right now. Let me go ahead and we'll stop the screen share. And then we'll go to our article today. So we're going to finish this up. There's basically a lot of crap in this, a lot of stuff that's just kind of filler. So we're going to be skipping over a large portion of this today, but we're going to hit some of the key stuff. Now, this is evidence-based mental health investment. Evidence-based support for mental health and trauma is essential on campus. Kirkpatrick, 2013, surveyed nearly 3,000 U.S. adults and found that 90% of respondents experienced reported a history of exposure to one or more traumatic events under the DSM-5, but PTSD prevalence was low, with lifetime PTSD about 8.3%, past 12 months and past 6 months. Okay, so 90% of people experience some sort of trauma within their lifetimes. Okay, that's fair. That doesn't really speak to college campuses, though, but okay. A majority of the people out there have had some sort of trauma within their lifetimes. And the majority, it appears, of that 90% don't actually experience PTSD. But those who do tend to have it for a lifetime versus 12 months or 6 months. So now he goes to colleges. 4 colleges, Reed, surveyed about 3,000 college students from 2 U.S. universities and found that 66% reported a history of exposure to DSM-5 traumatic events, while 9% met the criteria for PTSD. The frequency of traumatic events that were reported by college students in the paper were life-threatening illnesses, about 35%, death of a close one, 34%. I'm sure that's part of that 66%. So don't be, this can be a bit tricky in understanding, and people can misunderstand this. It might be, oh, 1 in 3 people have a life-threatening illness. No, 1 of 3 people of that 66%. So 1/3 of 66 is what, 22%? So that's closer to a 1 in 5 than a 1 in 3. So okay, death of a close one, 34%, natural disaster, 26%, physical violence, 24%, other events, 20%, sexual assault, 7%, and combat, 1%. Now I'm noticing that the only reference to sex is sexual assault and not necessarily rape. I'm going to imagine that that's being lumped in together, but that only represents 7% of the 66%, which would be about 4 to 5%, actually probably closer to 4%, of all students of the 3,000 in the 2 universities. Just putting that out there. These findings suggest that prevalence of PTSD over time is low compared to the high prevalence of exposure to a variety of traumatic events. Okay, yes, that's true. In addition, these studies inform us of the broad range of issues that students deal with in addition to stressors resulting from the rigors of university coursework. Okay, fair enough. Certain types of traumatic experience have been demonstrated to be linked with high likelihood of meeting criteria for PTSD. Breslau analyzed data collected from about 35,000 respondents through the National Epidemiologic Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions and found that 8.7% who experienced sexual assault, 8.7 who reported sexual assault, 40.2% or 3.5% of the total developed PTSD. So out of about 35,000 people for alcohol and related conditions experienced PTSD. Okay. And, this is actually saying something that is taking away from his point, but he's going to ignore it in just a moment. Just watch. The thing is that trigger warnings are generally caused by people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. It's rather hard pressed for anyone who doesn't have PTSD to have trigger events. It can happen, but as we've discussed in this paper, it's more associated with PTSD. Now, the point that he's showing us here is that a low percentage of people actually have PTSD, but feminists and social justice warriors and Wesley Chu here would convince us that this problem is a lot more prevalent than is what is being demonstrated. Now, PTSD is a very serious thing, and anyone who has it needs help. But when we over expose this issue and say that so many people have it, it does a disservice to those who actually have it. Okay, so Walsh found that in a sample of 2,000 college women, the 12.5% who reported experiencing sexual victimization, 50%, which was about 6.3%, experienced sexual re-victimization, and of those who reported re-victimization, 40%, 2.5, met criteria for past 6 months PTSD, and 58%, 3.7, met criteria for lifetime PTSD. Across all sample groups, Walsh found that re-victimization increased the likelihood of developing PTSD, with 40% and 55% of re-victimized women meeting the criteria for PTSD, compared to 19 to 34% of women who did not experience re-victimization. Well, okay, that seems logical to me. I mean, only 12.5% of women out of 2,000 college women experience re-victimization of sexual assault. I'm presuming this means that they were raped more than once. Okay, yeah, yeah, that's going to cause PTSD right there. If someone experiences it once and then experience it a second time within their lifetime, that's going to be hard on anyone. So yeah, that's. But again, and I'm not trying to come down hard on anyone who experiences PTSD, but once again, when we're talking about 12.5% of women who experience sexual victimization, the 12% out of 2,000. And of those, only 6% were re-victimized of it, and those who were re-victimized of it, 2.5% had PTSD. So 2% of women in this experience PTSD, or actually, it's probably like 6% based on the numbers I'm seeing. 6% of 2,000 women experience PTSD. So what's that, like 120 out of 2,000. Very serious, and I hope that those women got help, but we are still talking that PTSD is not as common as it's presented in this paper. Walsh also noted that in their study, rates of victimization, re-victimization, lifetime PTSD, and past 6 months PTSD were not significantly different between colleges and non-college women. LaGuardia contend that in the classroom, traumatized students are not uncommon by citing estimates that 1 in 5 women will experience rape or attempted rape in college, based on National Institute of Justice report on sexual victimization of college women, which that report has been refuted by the Department of Justice, indicating that it's like 1 in 88 women will experience rape in colleges, and women in college are safer than women not in college. The survey found that of about 4,500 college women surveyed during the spring of 1997, 2.8 experienced completed rape and 1.7 of attempted rape incidents, about 1.1%. The paper proposed that assuming victimization rates remain stable over a woman's college career, the projected rate over one period would be about 5%, and over a 5-year degree period, upwards of 25%. So basically, what they're saying is that, see, and this is where the math gets tricky. I mean, the 1997 report basically shows that about 5% experience a completed rape or attempted rape. Well, no, only about 2.8%. And and the problem with this is that it's like, well, if it remains stable, it's not like every year a woman faces the same odds of sexual assault, and that it's cumulative, so we have to keep adding it up. That's not how the math works. You're using tricky math to try to say that 1 in 5 women will experience rape. That's not what you're saying. You know, you're saying, if anything, what you're saying is that a woman has a 1 in 20 shot of experiencing rape every year. But that remains true every single year. Every year, there's a 1 in 20 chance that she'll be raped, if we believe that 5%. In fact, it's lower than that. It's about 3% for completed or attempted rape. See, it's just using tricky math here, and no one's bothering to look it up. Now, we know that this is false because it's actually 1 in 88% of college women. A more recent study from the Bureau of Justice Statistics surveyed 23,000 undergraduate students, 15,000 females, 8,000 males, at 9 post-secondary institutions, found during 2014 to 2015 academic year, the average frequency of completed rape for female students was 4.1%, ranging from 2 to 8% across schools. For sexual assaults, the average was about 10.3%, ranging from 4.2 to 20 across schools. For male students, the average frequency of completed rape was 0.8%, ranging from 3 to 1.4 for sexual assault, an average of 3.1%. It is also important to note that across 4-year schools, an average of 25.1%, ranging from 12.5% to 50% of senior females reported unwanted sexual contact since entering college. which it's not really defining here. And there's a difference between unwanted sexual contact and rape. And that's the key thing right there. Fine. And I'm not trying to say that, unwanted sexual contact should be ignored. If there's an actual problem here, we should address it, but don't try to lump it in with rape and try to say that there is a rape culture, an epidemic, and that unwanted sexual contact. And this is something that Matt Damon got in trouble for, by Mimi Driver, but the internet as a whole. And he tried to say, yes, there's a problem, but we should differentiate between a woman getting a slap on the ass and a woman being raped. Same thing here. And of course, so many people, especially feminists and social justice warriors, want to basically say that it's one and the same. If you do one, you're basically doing both. It's bullshit, but that's really what's being said. Okay, so Curbs note that the data obtained from the study are not intended to serve as a national average, and that each school needs to understand the magnitude and nature of the problem at their school or university if they're going to effectively address it. I agree. Aside from sexual assaults, other traumatic experiences, students are also dealing with a variety of mental health challenges. Eisenberg surveyed 14,000 students across 26 campuses in 2007 and 2009 and found that common mental health problems included depression, non suicidal self injury, general anxiety, suicidal ideation, and panic disorder. And even if we take these as separate, I'm sure there's a lot of crossover. We are still only talking about 18%. Without actually looking at it, I don't know what the average is, but 18% out of 14,000. In the American College Counseling Association 2014 National Survey of Counseling Centers, 275 centers representing 3.3 eligible students were surveyed, and 94% of directors reported increases in students with mental illnesses and psychological problems over the past 5 years. A varying percentage of centers directors noted increases in different areas related to anxiety or disorders, 89%, immediate crisis, 69%, psychiatric medical issues, 60%, clinical depression, 58%, learning disabilities, 47%, sexual assault, 43%, self injury, 35%, and prior sexual abuse, 34%. So that's quite impressive. In fact, I would lead with that next time. But I mean, that's quite a bit. 3.3 million eligible students were surveyed at 275 centers in 2014, and 94% had students that described some sort of mental illness. Now, I'm not saying that, well, in all of this, I'm basically saying that PTSD is such a low rate. But as we are finding, is that all sorts of people suffer from some sort of mental illness. And unfortunately, most people are not able to get help for that, especially men. And the help that they do receive doesn't actually help them. It just kind of disregards the entire problem and just throws medication at it and it's like, hope you feel better. So, yeah, there is a serious problem here. But just because people have mental health issues doesn't mean that they should expect the world around them to change just because they're having a problem. It doesn't work that way. So here's something in red. The numbers highlight the trend of increasing mental health issues among students and the need for quality counseling services across university campuses. See, this is not something that's new. We've known that people suffer from mental health problems for a very long time. This isn't something that suddenly popped up. The only thing that's been new is that more people are reporting that they have trigger warnings over course loads, even though people have had problems, PTSD, depression, anxiety, self-cutting. These problems have existed for a very long time, and students have had them. We've had students commit suicide. We've had students drop out. We've had students who do get triggered. But the thing of it is that we've had this for a very long time. Why is it suddenly now so much more important that we deal with something? And the reason why is because more people are saying, well, I'm triggered by this. Well, how are you different than the 100 years prior of students who basically took the same exact class and did just fine? And these are issues that are not being addressed. So this part, we're going to skip a lot of stuff, but I'm going to go ahead and read. And this is a very important thing that he states here. So evidence-based path and potential for integration into the classroom. If there's one thing that even the advocates of trigger warnings can come to a consensus on, is that trigger warnings are not the solution. Trigger warnings are neither a solution to mental health challenges that students face or the needs of individuals recovering from trauma. I do agree with that. Using trigger warnings in the classroom is not a solution at all. It only aims to disrupt the classroom, to try to control what information is given, and to say, well, we don't need to learn everything. We only need to learn what we want to learn. And that's the slippery slope that we're now seeing. Okay, so Carter suggests that traumatized individuals know that trigger warnings will not save us. Well, if someone is receiving proper counseling for, traumatic disorder, and they have trigger warnings, then they know that having triggers happen is not an indication that the world needs to change. It's an indication that they need to learn how to cope with what happens in the world. Excuse me. LaGuardia, trigger warnings are not a solution but an aid to help students with post-traumatic stress to gain access and engage in the classroom. The author suggests that trigger warnings are not meant to solve the problem traumatized students face, nor can they, and that the most trigger warnings can do is allow students time to muster whatever resources are needed to enable confronting the relevant material. Okay, that's all well and fine, but when trigger warnings are used to basically say, well, you can't have a test that even mentions the word rape, even though that's part of the curriculum because it might trigger someone, that's not saying, okay, it allows a student time to, muster the ability to cope with the situation. It's saying you need to remove it. It's basically propaganda. It's not propaganda, it's basically censorship. It's basically saying there are certain things that you're allowed to teach and certain things you're not allowed to teach, and that students are not allowed to be challenged in any way. Root suggests that trigger warnings are not intended to prevent all students from experiencing re-traumatization, but rather they have potential to serve as an advisory element which helps foster a culture of informed learning where students can consent to their learning environment. Bullshit. You need to consent to your learning environment. You're going to motherfucking college. You already consented. You walked into the door. You consented to whatever they teach you. And if you do not consent to that, then you don't go to college. Don't give me this, oh, it allows them to consent. Bullshit. No, that's not how it works. You can't just walk into an area and say, well, I have to consent to what's happening around me. Hell, I went to give plasma this morning, and some jackass was blasting his radio in his car, while I'm sitting there waiting there. And, I really don't want to listen to that. He was blasting it to the highest level, and all I hear is boom, 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 boom. I didn't consent to that, but does he not have the right to do that because I have a problem with that? No. I mean, well, yeah, he has a right to do that. It doesn't matter what I think or feel at that present moment. I didn't consent to that. Who fucking cares? He has the right to do it. I cannot impede his right to do it. I could ask him to turn it down, but he doesn't have to do it. I don't have to consent to anything because if I don't like it, I can leave. That's how the world works. And we can't turn colleges into places of, oh, well, you have to consent to be taught anything. You have to consent to where you're at. And if you're not able to consent, then it's up to everyone else around you to change their behavior so you can feel able to consent. Consent, look, I'm not against consent as far as, if you're engaging in activities such as sex, you need to give consent or else it is rape. But to say that you need to give consent to learn and that trigger warnings are your way to do that, that is such fucking bullshit. Given the rationale for trigger warnings is more about consent as suggested above and less about helping students deal with psychological distress, this report indicates that there are evidence-based paths that university instructors can consider in equipping students with adaptive coping strategies or skills. Below are 3 interventions that have bodies of existing research demonstrating their efficacy in improving the life of individuals with PTSD symptoms and other psychiatric conditions. This report suggests that with the slew of unanswered questions on how trigger warnings facilitate adaptive or maladaptive coping strategies, the following evidence-based interventions can be considered when it comes to developing services and best practices for individuals with trauma. This section will provide a brief overview of each intervention, the mechanisms by which they operate, and the potential for integration into the classroom setting or curriculum. So, prolonged exposure therapy. So, in prolonged exposure therapy, the fundamental framework of the intervention is built around acknowledging and working through experimental avoidance that results from traumatic experiences. In most cases, the first few sections are devoted to constructing a hierarchy of avoidant behaviors along with action plan that includes exercising techniques and homework geared towards helping individual distinguish memories from the actual traumatic event and associated stress. For example, for individuals dealing with sexual trauma, the process may include contacting the original experience through imagination while orally ascribing the events to past tense, repeating the process with awareness to emotional states, and engaging with tape recordings of the narrative to aid in vivo homework exercises. Okay, that sounds fine for therapy, but to suggest that professors have to be responsible for this, no. And that's the part that I have problems with. If you want to give this kind of therapy to people that are recovering from sexual assault, that's fine. And if it works, fantastic. If it helps people learn how to cope and be in the classroom, great. But to expect professors to take away time from teaching to teach students coping strategies? No, that's not their job. They're not there to teach them psychology. The only one there to teach them psychology are psychology professors. A math professor is there to teach math. An English professor is there to teach English, to teach writing. A history professor is there to teach history. You can't then also say that every professor has to have both a degree in the thing that they're teaching and a degree in psychology so that they can properly teach students how to cope with the material that they're learning about. That's asinine. That's, oh my lord. So, yeah, a lot of this we're going to skip past. I just wanted to read that first part. Yeah, I'm going to skip that too. It's just a bunch of, I mean, it talks about things that can be done, but it really talks like, here are some things you can do, but let's not fully explain it, but tries to use numbers to basically say that it's necessary. I mean, if you get a chance to read it, go ahead, but I just found it mostly pointless. Okay, so here are the recommendations, and we're almost done with this. Recommendations that the author suggests that we follow in order to deal with this epidemic of trigger warnings. So, teaching coping skills. This paper suggests that one approach to tackling mental health and trauma on campus is to incorporate the teaching of proactive coping skills in the classroom and through co curricular modules. Arming students with adaptive coping skills will go a long way in helping students become adult learners. Stallman characterizes as having the ability to effectively interact with the diversity of people, learning content relative to the program of study they choose to enroll, and tolerate diverse and often contradictory opinions of others. Okay, but I don't think that needs to be in the classroom. If a student is having problems coping, then they need to go seek help outside of the classroom. It shouldn't be done inside the classroom. So here's a big red area. Universities should consider drawing on existing frameworks of the MSBR modules in medical and social work programs to develop similar modules in disciplines that view reduction of trauma symptoms and psychological distress in their students as pressing need. Presented at the start and throughout the year, instruction and skills in these modules will equip students with resources to draw from pre and post exposure to difficult material. There's potential for instructors to work collaboratively with the MSBR practitioners to tailor curriculum and incorporate core mindfulness exercises toward the specific course and students' needs. Also, making AC training accessible as workshops or co-curricular training sessions throughout the year would be consistent with the goal of equipping students with adaptive coping strategies. So once again, a professor must take time aside from their curriculum, what they need to teach in a given year. And I don't really know what a college university is like, but I remember that in you know school through all the years that I took it, the teachers often felt that there wasn't enough time to do everything they wanted to do or to get along as fast as they need to do. I always felt like there just wasn't enough time. And now and I'm going to imagine it's the same thing in universities. They need to make sure that every student is learning. They need to take time aside for that. And so they have to plan their curriculum around that. Now they have to plan it even further by saying, oh, well, you need to teach them coping strategies. Okay, here are the coping strategies for how to deal with the content in this classroom. I'm not a psychologist myself, but according to this piece of paper, I'm now your psychologist. I'm now your therapist. And I now need to teach you how to use these coping strategies in order for you to learn. Now, I could be talking to you about the coursework itself, and so you can get the most out of this, which is going to help you, in whatever future thing you decide to do with your life. But instead of doing that, I'm going to teach you coping mechanism because there's a small percentage of you that might have difficulty with this, but are not adult enough to go get help on your own. So all of you have to suffer because a small minority of you cannot act like adults. Okay, so personalizing warnings. Given the wide range of potentially distressing material, Boysen suggests that trigger warnings may need to be personalized to best serve the needs of individuals with diverse experiential, psychological, and physiological makeups. Personalization of trigger warnings can be accomplished through university online learning systems. So basically, if you're going to give someone a trigger warning, you need to understand what their trigger warning is, even if they decide not to tell you, and then personalize it to them. And a professor needs to do this for every single student that they have, just on the off chance that they might have a trigger warning and waste even more time and resources in coddling the students. Again, that's why you have therapy to get that kind of coddling. LaGuardia suggests that adding the option to place content notification in links to support resources through online learning systems would seem like a natural and simple solution. By tailoring built-in features in online learning systems to include an option for showing or hiding trigger warnings, individuals who do not wish to be subjected to trigger warnings in a course that uses them have the choice of opting out. But the way people are, I'm sure someone will not click it and then say, oh, I was triggered by the trigger warning. It should be removed. I can't learn now. I can't take this class. You should just give me an A. Well, there was an option there for you to check it off. Yeah, but I didn't check it off and I still saw it. Oh, Lord. Also, having the option of selecting trigger warnings as an on, off, or customizable at any point during the course enables individuals to control the way they engage with materials, without, or selecting warnings, or select warnings, at different stages of the course and mental health treatment. The resulting flexibility is in line with the goal of respecting the autonomy of individuals with trauma who can carry with them diverse coping skills sets and may not necessarily wish to be subject to trigger warnings in the coping process. But this paper has basically said that people can't really be expected to be responsible for what triggers they may have or to learn coping skills, and that it's up to the professor to help determine what they can and can't handle and customize their curriculum around that. And by putting options in there for people to find out what trigger warnings there are, no one's going to do it. I mean, you've basically stated that people can't be responsible for themselves. that they can't get help outside the classroom that they need to get to learn to cope with it, and that's up to the professor to do it. So having an option in there that can help people dictate what their level of therapy needs to be seems asinine when you've basically stated that the opposite is true. I think people should be responsible for their mental health. And only in rare cases is someone not capable of dealing with their own mental health issues. But then those people tend not to be part of society, anyways. Individuals are responsible for whatever mental health problems that they have, and again, cannot expect the rest of the world to change according to them. If warnings are personalized, students can choose whether or not they want to be exposed to labels for subjective concepts such as disturbing, offensive, cissexism, sexism, misandry, misogyny. They can engage with aspect of course material without exposure to the prejudgment cast by those warnings. Note that degrees of separation between a clear-cut image depicting rape, the subjective interpretation of sexism from a passage in a novel, and a statistic on abortion should be kept in mind. Individuals should have the choice to interpret the text without explicit presupposition of how they might react to certain scenes in the text or pieces of information. By handling students, by handing students the responsibility of reviewing or personalized warnings beforehand, professors could start the course or individual lectures by engaging in brief discussion about topics such as the necessity of discomfort in the learning about difficult materials, differences between personal discomfort and institutionally sanctioned epidemic, epistemic violence, and disagreeing without demanding or disrespecting one another. So, yes, once again, a professor has to take time aside to explain something to a student that should be painfully obvious by the time they get to college. And if a student has any problem with what's being conducted in the classroom, they need to go see a mental health professional so they can learn the coping strategies so they can deal with the problems at hand. This is not up to the professor to help coddle people to what they can and can't handle, and then try to encourage them to use coping strategies. What you're end up going to do is messing up students a lot, because psychology is not something that you engage in easily, because all professors are going to do is just read from a thing, and if they're asked any questions, well, they're not most are not qualified to answer those kinds of questions. You need a mental health professional. Ensuring the equality and inclusivity of accommodations. Thirdly, instructors who utilize trigger warning should make sure such accommodations are equitable and inclusive as possible. As such, when adopting warnings, instructors should seek to avoid what Proctor refers to as hierarchy of trauma, which results in the privilege of certain forms of trauma over others when material deemed worthy of warnings are selected on an arbitrary basis. If trigger warnings are not personalized, the only way to ensure the accommodation is truly equitable and inclusive would be to label all materials as potentially traumatizing. I need to stop soon. So, yeah, there's a lot of bullshit with this here, but let's read this red part. One way to ensure adequate coverage of conditions with trauma based distress is to compile a comprehensive document for teachers and university administrators. For psychiatric conditions ranging from phobias to PTSD, the DSM-5 and related scientific literature should be consulted. In addition, a review of past topics from self-help and feminist forums would round out the list of topics. The forum from which trigger warnings first originated would supply a valuable list of topics not included in the DSM-5 and perhaps unfamiliar to academic settings, some of which would include acephobia, fear of asexuality. I've never heard of that, but okay. Animal in wigs, alcoholism, emetub, well, basically the fear of vomiting, finger snapping, pregnancy, sizeism, slut shaming, the rapper Chris Brown, and trypophobia, the fear of small holes. Really? You want to have a document to give to instructors that say, don't teach about these things? And not only do you want to start with the DSM-5, but then you want to go to feminist forums to fill out the list of things that you're not allowed to talk about. Wow. Wow. Okay, implications. In this report, the exploration of trigger warnings reveals two things. One, the notable absence of empirical evidence supporting the efficacy of trigger warnings, which, if you read back through this document, there's a reason why there's not any empirical evidence, because there's empirical evidence that it's not necessary. Two, a perceived lack of interest in obtaining this evidence. No, there's not evidence that there's a lack of interest in it. It's that no study has demonstrated that there's a need for it. That, but even if you could say that, just because there's nothing that supports what you believe and think and feel doesn't mean it's a lack of interest. It doesn't mean that there's a lack of, supported evidence. What it means is that you have a personal bias against something and you want it to be true, and anything that contradicts what your personal bias is an indication that it's designed to be against you and that you choose to reject it. I mean, Henry Chu, honestly, if you went through this and it's like, okay, I acknowledge this other evidence I have, but, it doesn't answer this question, and these are the questions we need to find, it would be hard pressed for me to argue with you. And while, yes, you do present the opposite in your opposition to your viewpoints, you don't address the opposition. You just put it there, say they're wrong, and say that no one cares about finding information. You haven't yet demonstrated that there's even a need for this. That the majority of people who experience triggers in life are those with PTSD, and even by your own studies that you've posted demonstrate that a small percentage of people experience them. You've also demonstrated that this trigger warning culture has only existed in the last 3 years. That's when it began. Even though that people have had these kind of problems for a very long time, and the coursework has been pretty much the same for a very long time. And you're choosing to look at it as, here's a new symptom, what can we do to alleviate it, without first asking the question, why has this suddenly popped up? You're not addressing that problem. You're being dishonest, intellectually dishonest. You're looking at a symptom and assuming that it's a big problem and that we need to do something about it without actually looking at the cause of that problem. That's what the research needs to go into. Why is it now all of a sudden people want to say, well, I'm triggered by this. I shouldn't learn it. I'm going to go cry now. rather than to sit there and learn it, even if it makes them uncomfortable? Why is it someone can tell Christina Hoff Sommers that their dog is triggered by what they said, and that is seen as perfectly acceptable? And this is the kind of shit that destroys society. As shown earlier, there is no empirical evidence for the efficacy of trigger warnings on mental health outcomes in either classrooms, message boards, or psychiatric settings. The reason for the absence of empirical evidence on the impact of trigger warnings on students' mental health outcome could be, as LaGuardia suggests, that trigger warnings have not been in classrooms long enough to be studied. That's very true. And yet we're still not trying to address why are they suddenly prevalent. It's been 3 years since trigger warnings first migrated from online message boards into university classrooms, and given the increased prevalence of usage as indicated by surveys presented in the current state of trigger warnings on university campuses and the growing mental health crisis on university campuses, the time to produce research and collect data on trigger warnings is now. Implementing trigger warnings is easy. Finding out how they are impacting students is challenging work. The onus is on advocates and users of trigger warnings or their permutations to take the initiative and begin exploring the consequences of the warnings they are issuing. Well, there I actually agree with them. The onus is on the people using them to demonstrate that they are necessary. But again, it's putting responsibility on people who's trying to avoid responsibility for their own education, for their own mental health. I mean, demonstrate to me that it's actually necessary to do it and not use a lot of guesswork or try shaming tactics, but actually do a study on it. And I'm willing to look at it and actually get it peer reviewed, not academic peer reviewed, but actual peer reviewed. And I'll be willing to look at it and discuss it. But until then, all you have is conjecture on what your point of view is. Given that trigger warnings provide students the choice of avoiding distressing content, regardless of their intent, it's not unreasonable to suggest that if trigger warnings are taken as cues to utilizing avoidance behaviors, and if these behaviors are subsequently learned and maintained over time, it has major implications for the ability of students to cope with trauma and other mental health issues. See, you're going one way and then going a different way by the end. Because the one thing you don't really talk about in this paper, you would touch on it lightly, of people abusing this. You assume that anyone who's using this has an actual reason to use it, to use trigger warnings, and not to use it as a way to avoid content, to avoid the responsibility because they just don't want to do it. Hey, why take a class when you can say that you're triggered by it and get an automatic A? And if it's that easy to get an A, then everyone would do it. In addition, due to the existence of alternative interventions with supporting evidence for positive outcomes in practice beyond theory, someone doesn't understand what the word theory means, some may feel that the reasons for implementing trigger warnings are political and not conducive to helping students deal with the trauma and psychological stress in the long run. This paper suggests that there are two things advocates of trigger warnings can do to move closer towards providing a convincing argument that trigger warnings are indeed part of best practices in the classroom and have positive outcomes on students. One, produce research and data to support impact on students' mental health and other desired outcomes. Two, increase transparency for pedagogical practices that lack support research and evidence. And as I made a note to myself, in other words, start with a conclusion and work backwards to find evidence to support your claim. That's what he's recommending. Hey, people who have trigger warnings, if you have a trigger warning, find evidence to support that you need this. That is what he's actually suggesting. Not, hey, scientists over here, there are some people reporting these trigger warnings and some students who are not. And this has been going on for 3 years. Maybe you should do a study on people to find out what's going on and ask them questions and see what results from that, and then make conclusions based on the evidence. As it stands, the theory that trigger warnings are meant to be tools of access for traumatized individuals have observable impacts on individuals and positive outcomes on mental health as much scientific validity as religious postulations as suggested by VATS. Scientific validity is not everything. Oh my fucking God. He did not just write that. Scientific validity is not everything. So that's how he dismisses every other point. No, scientific validity is fine when it supports what you think and feel, but the moment that it doesn't, well, it's not everything. You don't really need scientific validity. Even though you're telling people that if you want to demonstrate that your cause is necessary and you need to find evidence, you need to do scientific research, it's not really anything at all. It's just something for the skeptics. You don't really need it. Are you fucking kidding me? Harry Chu, you should be. No, I'm not going to say that because then that can be misconstrued. You should flunk out of college. I mean, what? You're in biological systems or whatever? You should flunk for saying that exact phrase. Scientific validity is not everything. You're in fucking biology and you don't think that scientific validity is important? You should fail. Big fat F on your fucking transcripts, and you should be kicked out of school for saying that. Scientific validity is not everything, but is necessary if trigger warning advocates wish to present a convincing argument to the scientific community, including academics, research, psychologists, and practitioners, that trigger warnings are indeed impacting students in ways that have been suggested. So they're not everything, but if you want to win an argument, you need to do it. That's all he's saying right there. You can go ahead and have your trigger warnings, but if you want to be taken seriously, then you need to prove it scientifically. But after you have that, then you really don't need to worry about science anymore. Outside universities, stakeholders with others who hold scientific validity of practices to high regard and make evidence-based decisions will also need convincing. Advocates who seek to promote support for efficacy of trigger warnings using scientific method should work towards developing appropriate or drawing on existing measures for evaluating trigger warning outcomes. Studies should be designed with control groups, participant randomization, and set up basically being able to repeat the findings. Findings would be the first of these kinds and provide a starting point for future research on the efficacy of trigger warnings. The research would also add to the existing body of scientific research on trauma triggers, coping strategies, and evidence based interventions. In complement, quantitative data can shed light on measurable outcomes of trigger warnings, anxiety coping, psychological distress, experimental avoidance, resilient measures. Quantitative data can provide in depth information on the changes in appraisal towards potentially distressing materials pre and post exposure, changes in the threshold of distressing material over time, and increased access for traumatized students. If gender studies as a discipline stands to take the lead in facilitating the use of trigger warnings across discipline, as Stringer suggests, the onus is on them to start looking at producing research exploring descriptive measures above. Qualitative research offers several people of compatibility with the fundamental feminist framework of gender studies programs as reference in social media methods, social research methods. Yeah, my mind is starting to go. So before I read the rest of this, it's like, again, it's just saying a lot of the same thing. You need to go and find evidence for what you support so you can convince those skeptics who use scientific methodology that you're right. And in fact, he's not even really suggesting that you should do it to get help or to help people with these problems. Like, if we can find, the science behind what's causing all of this, then we can take the step further to, treat people of this so this is no longer a problem. He's not suggesting that. All he's suggesting is if you find evidence for it, then you can have it. You can have trigger warnings in the classroom. According to feminist research, Maria Mize, these include promoting women's voices as opposed to ignoring them or submerging them in torrent of facts and statistics. Well, no, you have to learn um, facts and statistics. And if someone wants to speak on those, that's fine. And I know that what that's saying there. This is a common problem that's seen with STEM as being sexist towards women because it relies on statistics and facts. And women's brains don't necessarily work in that way. So when they're presented in an environment where those are important, they do poorly compared to their male counterparts. And it's not that it's sexist, it's just how different the mind and female mind are. But then there was a report saying that, the one school was changing how they were teaching STEM to be more subjective on its interpretation rather than being factual. Two, alleviating control over variables, thereby not perpetrating masculine concepts of control. And three, avoiding exploitation of female subjects as objects of research with nothing in return for experiences and knowledge. Just bullshit. Just bullshit. All right, let's get through this quickly. If advocates of trigger warnings reject the notion that trigger warnings need to be scientifically validated, the least they could do is increase the transparency of such practices given their controversial nature. There are many ways that this can be accomplished, so long as the motivation to undergo these tasks is adequate. For syllabus and content warnings, advocates should seek to produce comprehensive public documentation that lays out an up-to-date list of topics that have warranted warnings, specific materials corresponding to the topics listed, topics that have been requested but were not generated warnings, collection of detailed sample writings along with the rationales. Research should face few barriers collecting this information, as many professors have been open in sharing their warning practices and articles on the trigger warnings debate. For verbal warnings given in classrooms on material by material basis, advocates should serve well to upload recorded lectures demonstrating trigger warnings in live settings, given that students consent for participation. In conjunction, open panel discussion and information sessions should be held so that questions and concerns about the nature of warnings in the video can be exposed by stakeholders and members of the university community. Ugh. Here's a thing on international students. As it pertains to trigger warnings, universities should ensure that incoming students are fully informed about the nature of warnings and their intended purpose. Making an effort to explain the reasoning behind giving warnings makes intuitive sense given that the implementation of trigger warnings has been limited to institutions in Australia, Canada, UK, and the United States. Don't you think that might be like, I don't know, an indication that they might be silly to do since they're only in those countries and not like anywhere else? There's a lot of first world countries that you didn't list right there. Even within the US, the students in the Horton noted that instructors never explained why warnings were given before presenting materials, and that their knowledge of these warnings came from interacting with them on social media platforms such as Facebook. A teaching assistant in the study suggested that instructors should offer rationales for warning as they relate to specific content before they're explicitly given to ensure that students are informed. So, yes, not only should you give trigger warnings, you should explain why you're giving trigger warnings and what they specifically relate to. Wouldn't you need a trigger warnings on your explanation of trigger warnings, which would further need that you need an explanation of it? Oh, I need to give you a warning on something that might trigger you, but it's a necessary explanation to explain to you why I need to give you trigger warnings on everything else in this course. I mean, you're giving a lecture on trigger warnings about the lecture you need to give about trigger warnings so you can adequately give trigger warnings to your course syllabus. It's like trigger warnings inception. I'm going to read the conclusion, even though I don't have it marked up. And this is the last page. As discussions of trigger warnings and mental health progress, it's imperative for those on the peripheries of universities' campuses to stay informed. As individuals who are genuinely concerned about finding solutions to the mental health challenges on university campuses, we need to make a nuanced approach towards issues with complex assumptions and no empirical evidence. Advocates and users of trigger warnings should seek to produce evidence to justify their practices if they wish to take the lead in advocating for trigger warnings across disciplines. Once again, find evidence to your conclusions. Transparency for practices that lack evidential support is both beneficial and critical for maintaining a nuanced discussion on the issue. You want to have transparency for those on who implement them, but not transparency in collecting the evidence to support a conclusion. University administrators should continue to pursuing to pursuing evidence-based interventions in the process of tackling mental health challenges in and out of the classroom. If the motivation for undertaking such tasks is adequate, progress can be made in determining whether trigger warnings are productive in tackling mental health challenges or making things worse. So, first we have to allow them, then we can see if they're actually being effective or not. It's been 3 years since trigger warnings have migrated into classrooms. The time to produce research and collect data on their outcomes on mental health is now. No, it is not now. What it's time for, what it's time for is to research why has this suddenly popped up? Why are we suddenly seeing this? Why in the last 3 years? I mean, the traumas have lasted for a very long time. I mean, all of human history, people have experienced trauma. Throughout all of human history, we have taught sensitive subjects. But even if you just want to look at our modern education system, for the last 100 years, we've had these problems. For the last 100 years, we have taught this kind of course load. Even in the last 50 years, the last 20 years, we have. And yet, this has not become a problem until 3 years ago. 3 years ago. Why? Answer that question. Don't answer, hey, is it necessary to have it in the classroom? No. Answer why it's popped up. Why has it now become relevant? Why has it now become prevalent? That's the one thing that this entire paper does not address. It just says, hey, it's here now. We need to make it happen. We need to put this into the classrooms. We need everyone to change because a behavior that didn't seem to exist 5 years ago exists now, and we need to make changes. This paper is just absurd to the highest order. This is what passes for academic work. Now, he's not a psychologist, he's not in social services. He doesn't do anything that's related to why this paper is written. He's in biology. Now, from what I was told, he initially did this as a joke. And then as he started doing it more and more, he realized that there was more need for it. However, nothing in his paper has demonstrated that there actually is need for it. Nor is there anything in his paper that states that there's a conspiracy to not research this. All he's demonstrated, what he actually demonstrated is that we don't need this. That everything he put in there that was opposite of his viewpoint actually demonstrated that we don't need these things. And then he calls it, well, there's just a lack of interest. Well, there's a lack of interest because it's been demonstrated we don't need it. Your own paper works against you, and you choose to ignore it. You want to actually address this issue. You want to say that it's necessary, then you need to address the points of your opposition, not just show it and then ignore it. So, I'm glad to be done with this, and I'm sorry I didn't get to it sooner. But I'm going to get going. Be sure to check out my links down below. I do have the GoFundMe that was created by a fan from the Gator and Frog Network. So be sure to check that out. And if you want to help me get a computer, a modern computer, I mean, I have a desktop computer, but it's like a decade old. I cannot do the things that I need it to do. So I do need a new one. Not necessarily a brand spanking new one, but just enough to get me able to render videos. Hell, even this laptop is on its way out. I can't even use Microsoft Word for 10 minutes without it messing up. And I'm sure someone's out there, well, you can use Open Office. No, no, the problem is just the laptop. Plus, I can't really use Open Office, not the way you think I could use it. It presents a number of logistical problems. I'm not against Open Office, it's just all the stuff that I do actually does require Microsoft Word. Um, so yeah, if you can help out at all, please do that. You can also do my Patreon, link down below for that as well. But all the money right now is going towards trying to save up for a computer or my day-to-day life. I don't make too much from that. I mean, I make maybe about $30 a month. So yeah, that kind of goes to my day-to-day. But if I actually started making some good money on that, then I could actually get the computer that I need. Ideally, I'm hoping to get $1,000, even though it says $800. $1,000 would get me a bare bones system that could get the video rendering done. I also have my PayPal down below that, and also my book, How to Destroy a Woman Now. It's a parody book of how to destroy a man now, and I'm hoping that if we can get it to the #1 spot, then Amazon will take down both books. At the very least, take down the other book because my book's not really illegal. It's immoral, but not illegal. And the First Amendment does protect against immoral content. It's only when it's illegal that's when the First Amendment doesn't protect it. But buying that book also helps me out financially. Anywho, that's going to do it for me today. Uh, didn't get too many. Well, I didn't get any comments at all, but it's Friday, Good Friday, I think. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you, everyone. This is Mad Cat signing off.